Hey there, Nate Urandi, Orion Training Systems. You'll notice different hat today. It's about Costa Rica. It is maybe 20 degrees outside and snowing, and I'm quite frankly tired of winter already. Here it is, February 10th. Costa Rica hat because my wife and I are actually building a house there. They broke ground probably a month ago, no, 3 weeks ago, and we get status reports. It's moving along fast. Our goal is to be able to spend our first official time in it over Thanksgiving break. For those of you outside the States, that's late November, typically a week off here. So we're very excited. In any case, topic of the day, stress testing, specific to the bike. So I did my own stress test today just to chart progress, as I shouldn't say any, as most athletes do, whether it's swimming, running, biking, something else. There's always a benchmark to do to chart progress. Has the training you've done from your last benchmark to your current one been effective? And if so, how? And if not, why not? So the benchmark keeps you honest. Typically on the bike, especially when you're tracking power, ideally you would do this in a lab. Now, it's expensive. Not everybody has access to a lab. But if you do, what tends to be the odds-on most accurate type of testing is to hook you up to this mask. And instead of doing a VO2 max test, you instead do a ramp test. And what you do is after you get warmed up, you spend 3 minutes starting at 2 watts per kilo. So if you weigh 65 kilos, then you would start at 130 watts. You sit there for 3 minutes. At the end of those 3 minutes, you keep going, but some blood is taken out of your ear. And your heart rate is marked, your watts are marked, and then the amount of lactate you produce at that initial starting point is also marked. Then every 3 minutes, you ramp it up 0.5 watts per kilo. So from 2 to 2.5 watts per kilo for another 3 minutes, then to 3, then to 3.5, and so on. Now, you can do the test until you absolutely explode. But at some point, when you see an inflection point that dictates what your threshold is, you could actually stop the test there. People tend to go beyond it just to be sure. But typically, what you find then is what's your heart rate, what's your watts per kilo, and what's your blood lactate at your threshold. And that becomes your FTP, your functional threshold power. It's a great test. I do it every 18 months to 2 years, but it's definitely worthwhile if you have the opportunity. Now, that's not tenable for testing that happens periodically, meaning on a regular basis every cycle or every 1 to 2 cycles. So typically the rule of thumb is the 20-minute FTP test. The problem is that, to me, this is grossly inefficient and inaccurate. The reason, there's a lot of caveats with it. First of all, you blow yourself out for 5 minutes before the test. That builds up lactate, that tires you out, and then you spin easy for a little bit, and then you do your 20-minute test. And the premise is that you do the 5 minutes super hard first, because then when you do the 20-minute test, it more closely simulates what you might do for an actual hour. But the premise here is that doing a straight hour test isn't tenable. You can't stay mentally focused and excited for it for an hour of pain, which I agree with, but handicapping a 20-minute test first by blowing your legs out for 5 minutes, and then taking that 20-minute test and further handicapping it by multiplying it by 95% to then reach your FTP, to me that's too many variables that impact the actual result. It's good, but to me it's not great. And so for a couple of years now, I've been trying to figure out a better way to test. and using myself and a couple of the athletes I coach who have raised their hands as guinea pigs on this. And I went through a couple of things that seemed better hypothetically, but in practice really weren't great because, again, they weren't repeatable, they weren't sustainable. So what I locked onto more recently, and this is in last year, and then through this fall and winter that I think I've hit the nail on the head with, is a ramp test that is similar to what I explained at the beginning with the lab test, but conducted in such a way that you can do it at home by yourself or with somebody helping you there, jotting everything down. Either way, but you don't need a lab. And it's certainly consistent, repeatable, and you can absolutely chart progress. And the results in terms of what you base your training zones are based on the actual raw results. No handicapping, no multiplying, just this is your result, so here are your zones. And it's a ramp test that starts at 100 watts, and then every single minute you bump it up 10 watts. So if you have a smart trainer like a Wahoo Kicker, this is pretty easy. I have a Wahoo Kicker. I can't speak for every single smart trainer out there, but there's an app that I use and I put it in erg mode, and then every minute I basically just hit the plus button, it bumps it up 10 watts, and then I feel that added resistance on the direct drive. So I don't even have to try to hold the higher watts. The Wahoo forces me to, which is really nice. So you keep incrementally increasing those watts, 10 watts every minute until you explode. And then what you do is the last full minute you held, that wattage becomes your critical power. Then what you do is you spin easy for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you do a second test, and this is called a T-max test, your maximum time at critical power. So just like it sounds, you then take your critical power from the first ramp test, and then you hold it for as long as you can, typically between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. If you hold it for longer than 3 minutes, then chances are you may have stopped the ramp test a little early, or you were too fatigued going into it. I find that 2 to 3 minutes is a really solid T-max effort. So you have those two values, and that's how you start tracking your progress. So you repeat the ramp test. Maybe your critical power watts don't go up, but maybe your T-max gets longer. That's progress. Or maybe your critical power watts go up, and therefore when you do your T-max test at that higher watts, your time is similar or maybe a little shorter. In any case, I have found that this is a much better test than the FTP test, especially for pure cyclists. So at the risk of this getting too long, just wanted to bring that up. And certainly if you have comments or questions, leave it below. I can talk about how to structure your zones and how they're different from FTP zones in a follow-on here, or if somebody has a question, I can post it in the notes below. But in any case, give it a shot. Try the critical power ramp test and let me know what you think. Happy training.